Okay, so it looks like we have everybody on. Um, we will go ahead and get started then with our fifth RAC meeting. And thanks to everybody for joining. We're going to finish the final wrap up of the application piece. And I um, understand I do need to get the definitions into the Google Doc, so I will make sure we get that done today. So if there are any comments on the definitions piece, they will be in the Google Doc before the end of this meeting, and appreciate all the comments that everybody has provided in the other documents that are on there. And we'll continue our conversation and discussions. So Kevin, do you want to
Great.
start
Yeah, I
with
can take
this?
it away. So, kind of as a refresher, made it through most of the application requirements last week. We ended with discussions on some of the mitigation plan requirements, those type of things. And what we had left was one slide that covered kind of the last few elements of that. So hopefully, if you're following along in the other document, but basically, what we've called out now is kind of an actual stormwater plant management plan, and effectively, it's really going more toward how stormwater will be managed and prevented from discharging onto the ocean shore, both during construction and following. We've had a lot of projects that stormwater really is probably one of the bigger um, issues that comes out of it, and it's not necessarily considered. It's either what's causing the erosion or it's there's just a lot of pipes, especially a lot of black flexible pipe that gets kind of thrown over the bluff edge, and even after we'll do a project. And so trying to bring that up front, but also it's built into kind of ensuring that compliance with the DEQ um, requirements as well. After talking to DEQ, there can be stormwater management plan requirements that come into play as well. And so trying to at least get that being considered and upfront. So that's really what that is all about. Other permits is kind of a placeholder in our guidance. We'll create a list of more permits and also within the application forms. But currently we're fairly that I should say current rules have that in it already, that the applicant has to comply, and we have to have documentation of affected other permits and whether or not they've obtained them. So this is again trying to turn that around, so that as part of the application requirements, we're calling those out, and within both the guidance and also the application form, letting them know which are permits that they will have to have prior to permit issuance, and those that they would have to have before, even before they could apply, or at least be opening the dialogue up with those before they apply. So it's kind of a placeholder catch-all that moves that forward. What I've done though is taken some of those, as you've seen, through the other requirements and tried to build them into some of our requirements as well. Um, there's a basically placeholder for the geologic site report, and what we're calling a change analysis. We'll go over that in a subsequent meeting. I pushed that one because we didn't have some of our technical experts available for this meeting to go over the geologic reports. And really what that's coming down to is, tell us what's there and what the effects of the proposed project could be. And so really trying to call that out. But again, those will be more fleshed out in the geologic site report requirements. And then this new section is related to acknowledgements. And while I say it's new, what we're trying to do is call out that in the application and kind of as they're applying, we will be asking for acknowledgements from the applicant that they understand that there are some specific standard conditions and that, or willing to do that. While we may not call out each of these in length, kind of like I have in the current rule, some of that might get moved over to guidance. It is already built into our existing permit conditions where we can require these. But part of what we're doing is trying to pull it up front, like I said, and not only in the rule to say, hey, we can ask for these things, but then having that on the application forms to where effectively what it would say is, I acknowledge that I'm able to provide liability insurance for doing work on the beach, or I understand that I may have to provide a bond for the work, for the performance of the work, and then also that they'll have to be going to the county and recording their record of permit with the county, those kinds of things. And so it's really just trying to bring that up front into the application as far as a substantive portion of the application process. And then the evidence of construction value, again, that is something that is currently in our rule. And really it's going back to demonstrating that what it's going to cost to do the entire project, and effectively it'll also be who is working on those and what elements those include, so that it really is looking at that bigger picture of the construction costs for all the aspects. And that is that'll be used, that fee will, or sorry, that value will be used likely in both our fee calculation and potentially the bond calculations. So any thoughts or comments on these 4 or 5 topics? Okay. Well, I'm going to move on then to definitions. Let me get my computer working here real quick. All right. So for the definitions, we're looking at, again, the document, you were shared the Word document version of it. The Google Doc appears not to have come through. And I apologize, I'm having some computer buffering issues on my end. I'm not getting things to respond. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
Do not know what's going on here. Because I can't change slides or anything, so I do not know what just happened. Please give me a minute here. I'm going to try to get things closed down and see if I can get some stuff restarted here. Katie, before we jump in the definitions, what do you want to talk about feedback while I'm getting this going? Feedback from the previous meetings. That would probably be the best thing to do, because I think I might have to restart.
Sure. I was trying to see if I could just which I can do that, pull up the file and then you can talk through it if you want to do that.
Yeah, let me see if I can get it.
Or maybe
Let
Kevin's
me see if
already.
can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, let me see if I can get my couple of things restarted here, and then we'll try. But if you want to just talk about
Okay.
feedback from previous sections, we'll go from there.
Sure. So we have not incorporated, we've gotten the feedback that is in the Google Doc and then the feedback that's from each of these meetings, and it's not been incorporated in any of the drafts yet. We will get that piece done, and at the end we'll do some wrap up and have conversations about kind of where that went and make sure that we share out next iterations with that feedback included, and share the next documents once we get the feedback incorporated, but I didn't want you to think that the feedback wasn't taken. We just haven't had a chance to go back and update those drafts and incorporate the feedback. So continue to add those comments and thoughts, and you can go back to the previous version. So in the Google Drive, each one is in there, and I will get the definitions one in there. But we've just done each rule separately so that you can provide comments there throughout that. And while Kevin is, I know we have time set aside today to talk about any previous issues or questions that are coming up. So we could, while Kevin's restarting, we could go to that agenda item. If there are any issues on the areas that we've previously discussed that you want to bring up.
I have a question, but more about the timeline. So you said you will incorporate, our feedback and comments. But after, I know we have a certain number of meetings, scheduled. So is it included in those numbers of meetings for like us maybe to then discuss the cleaned up version or like the final draft? Or is it going to be an additional meeting or couple of meetings?
We're going to attempt to get it before that last meeting so that
Okay.
we can do it in that last meeting. There may be some where we get feedback after the meeting via the Google document, but we will attempt to get the feedback incorporated for that last meeting.
Yeah, thanks.
Diana, go ahead.
And when do you think that this process will be completed and these rules will be live?
The goal right now is to have the Oregon Parks, will do the RAC process, come up with a draft. The Oregon Parks and Recreation Commission will review opening the rules at their April committee meeting. So we should have a draft in April. It doesn't mean it's the final draft, but it will be a working draft. For their meeting is, I think it's April 22nd, 23rd, one of those 2 dates. And then we will go through a public comment process in May, and then look May, June, and review those comments, have a public hearing, and then looking to ask the Parks and Recreation Commission to adopt at their September meeting. So we would do the public hearing process late summer, or late spring, early summer, and then the adoption in September.
Thank you. It's great to know.
Other questions? Well, let me see if I can pull up the definitions, and we can start going through them. And when Kevin's able to join, then we'll switch. Oh, except for that, maybe Kevin's right here. Hold on just a moment. Are you able to share, Kevin? We're ready for definitions. If you're able to share your screen.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I think things are starting to load back up.
What I can do is share my screen and then you can.
I just about have my PowerPoint loaded up here.
Okay.
Sorry, everybody. All right, so just as a reminder to everybody, we kind of what we've gone through, we're focusing on um, the definitions this week. Last week we covered the application requirements, and then we've already covered the scope and purpose and the review process. Hoping in the next couple meetings to be able to go through these kind of next three or some combination of the next three over the next few meetings, and that's the geologic reports, kind of our permit decision standards and the permit conditions that result from that. So that is what we are looking at doing, and that should hopefully be through the month of February. And then March, we'll either be reviewing kind of some of the edits that I've made, or if we have time, being able to get to these last couple of sections related to the project specific criteria and general authorizations. As we talked about before, there's a chance we may need to do a phase 2 rulemaking to cover those, since those are kind of new sections. But yeah, we'll see where we get on that. So as far as definitions, what I have done here for us to kind of look through the things is just put this all up as kind of a slide of each of the top, or each of the headings. Wasn't because of the amount of text, I wasn't necessarily planning on walking through the document line by line. But we can definitely pull that document over when we want to talk about a specific definition. So basically what I've done here is some of these that have lighter text, lighter blue text, I'd like to kind of talk through. But basically we have I have currently 66 definitions in the list. As we refine that, we may reduce this. But right now I've kind of been, as I've been going through each section, trying to pull out those terms that either are new, unique to our program, or have a specific meaning. Some of them may be able to get rolled into a specific section where they're only used once or twice in a very specific section. We may be able to pull them in there, but this part of why I put this together now is I know the last few meetings there's been some questions about, well, what do some of these terms mean? And so I wanted to make sure that I got this out in front of everybody sooner than later. I apologize for it not being out earlier than this. You'll see some of the notes on there. I do have some that are placeholders as I refine the permit decision document. Some of those terms may get used in that documentation, or they may get, like I said before, they may get pulled kind of more in substance into that section and removed from the definitions. But wanted to be in full transparency, kind of throw everything out in front of you. So that's how we have the 60 some definitions. So as we go through these, I have a couple of them that I really want us to focus on. But these that I have the blue are kind of one of those that I want to make sure that I get some good feedback on. I'm open to getting feedback from any of them. But the ones that are in the lighter blue are those that I think may have some more questioning, or also kind of more applicable to a broader portion of our applications and projects. So with that, action is the first definition down here. And I back up on this. What I'd like to do is, as each of these slides, I'd like to kind of solicit input from all of these, even if we don't talk about them while we're on the slide. And so if you have thoughts on any of these black ones, even though we don't necessarily go through them individually, we can, this is your opportunity to pull out those definitions and talk about them. So with action, this is a new term, and it was kind of added in because we do have activity, and we've used activity as a term in the past, where activity is really more of, I'll call it alteration type. It is shoreline protection or public access. That's really more of the meaning, where an action was trying to get more at the construction equipment, staging, these pieces that are part and parcel to the alteration activity that's going on. And so that, because we've had a lot of dialogue with applicants and trying to explain that an alteration is inclusive of these activities, by bringing that action kind of out there allows us within, and as the way I've used it in the rules, to kind of try to pull that out so that when we're talking about those actions, it's not just, well, I want to build a revetment. No, it's what actions are you doing? How are you doing that? And those things are associated, and they are part of the alteration and part of what needs to be evaluated. So that is the purpose for that. So any thoughts on what I have put together? I'd love to hear. John.
Yeah. So this is just a thought. So it says action means any undertaking or operation related to. You might consider saying action as it relates to means this. That way, when somebody argues the word was used in a certain way later on, it gives you some flexibility. Somebody may use the word action in some other context or something in some document. You wouldn't want to get hamstrung or trapped, but that way you're just as it relates to, and then it means this. So can I skip ahead one?
Absolutely.
The other one I was going to mention, administrative denial. It says, sorry, it's not the highlighted one, but administrative denial means the denial where the department documents that the applicant has failed to provide a satisfactory and complete. I don't know if you want to consider using the word or. And the only reason I say that is I don't know how possible it is, but somebody could come along and say, well, it was an unsatisfactory application, but it was complete. And it does say and, so that would also allow you some more flexibility in the use of that term. Adverse effect. I like that one. And then affected landowner. I did have a question. There's at the last semicolon under the sub E. Is it the last one? Oh, it's just, basically it's the last one. I just wanted to know, it doesn't matter but I'm thinking you're going to put an or behind that, because that's going to dictate how those bullets will be used.
That between E and F.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes, there should be an or there. Thank you.
Yeah. I think that's just right off of the A's. That's what I see. These are really good, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Okay. Yeah, good. Thanks.
Okay. And while you guys are thinking of other A comments, the affected landowner, so that's used a couple different times. One is in our public notice. The other is related to when we're determining whether or not you have to have, well, I guess there's 3 times. One is going to be the public notice. One is going to be determining the effects and whether or not you need to have a landowner authorization, or then the third one is more of impacts too, and considering that. This also ties in with the direct and indirect definition as well, because there's a directly affected landowner and indirectly affected landowners within there. And so this is kind of trying to structure that in so that that we can build in that kind of broader procedural elements into what is an affected landowner. And again, that has been something that has gotten questioned quite a bit. We currently have that framework within our rule, but it's very subjective, or I'm sorry, it's very subjective on how we determine that. And there's a lot of opportunity for questioning how we chose to just determine that. And we have some very specific things, like with public notice, it's only the ocean fronting properties to the north and south. And so it's very limited. So again, by doing this, we kind of cover the intent of the public review is to notify affected landowners. The intent of our review is to make sure that affected landowners aren't negatively impacted. And so that's part of the importance of calling that out. So any thoughts on the A's? Would love to have any feedback you have. Okay, well, we'll move on to the next list here. I didn't really have any specifically that I was looking at, but I will say some of like the beach and the dune definitions were taken or I'll say adapted from the definitions from DLCD. They are a little bit different, but that's also because DLCD has things like the with dunes, there's things of they have stable references and kind of how that different kind of variations that way, and where I'm trying to be more inclusive of saying, hey, it is both stable and conditionally stable or active. It doesn't really matter. The dunes are the dunes as long as they're on the ocean shore. And so that's why I say they're kind of an adaptation of that. Any thoughts or edits on the list in front of you? Okay. So the next batch, the emergency ones we've already seen. We already talked about the environmentally acceptable lubricants. This was just trying to actually define what those mean, but that was something that we talked about at our last meeting with the application requirements, and that is being able to spell out that those are something that's required within the ocean shore and need to be considered. The environmentally sensitive area, I took a definition from the California Coastal Act, and this is one of those placeholders, which I noticed I didn't put a note on that, but it's one of those that I'm actually thinking of using in lieu of some of the discussions that we had last meeting related to some of the natural resource areas, is how do we try to kind of cover that in a more broader sense as a term. And so that is why I asked the question here, was more of, is that type of statement get at that broader, like we're looking at this broader thing versus having it very, very specific. John, go ahead.
Yes, I was going to ask about that. How do you, I mean, maybe it's a general question, and I don't know if this is like maybe a rhetorical question, but I mean, it's kind of how do you separate that from an environmentally insensitive area? And I know that's not exactly how you would phrase that or whatever, but if you're delineating between two tiers of area based on some environmental condition, it says means any area where plant or animal life habitat, especially valuable because of their species and nature. I mean, I can just see somebody coming along and making some argument one way or the other about any particular area. So it kind of, and maybe I don't have an answer or a recommendation or something like that, but sometimes I see in our code, for instance, this isn't land use, but it's, something has been determined to be, it becomes adopted to a comp plan, it becomes identified, it's mapped, etc. I could see anything that's like a mapped wetland being an environmentally sensitive area, just carte blanche. So I don't know if you'd want to add to, I mean, the definition's great. I don't know if you would want to add to the definition to lock in certain areas that we just know can't be argued about, and then leave everything else kind of nebulous in case you want to have some latitude there, and then you have to have some defendability to that argument. So those are just my thoughts. Sorry, it's kind of random. So
No, that's a really good point, and I think that was part of the dialogue we were having last meeting related to the application requirements, and that there was a lot of very specific pieces in there, and so this was one of those like, hey, we could potentially replace that with a term more like environmentally sensitive area, and that was kind of where I was going with this, as that placeholder. Like I said, I just didn't make the note. But those are really good points, and I think that's going to be that balance between being specific and general, since we don't have all of those things mapped yet. Go ahead. Tyler, you had your hand up.
Hey, Kevin, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Environmentally sensitive area, like I kind of like what John was saying. I was sort of thinking that we should somehow tie that to the Marine Reserve program. I mean,
And
kind of like John was
would
saying,
be
thinking of specific, specific areas, but we don't have any like Marine Reserve identified in the definitions here. But I don't know if we need to. I'm just thinking that might be a good tie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, and that was the intent behind this, was in that section in the natural resources where I had, remember in the application requirements that we talked about last meeting, was there was a lot of that tie back to some of the standards from the Marine Reserve areas that were very specific. And so this would have been that thought of kind of taking that and wrapping that up. But that's a good point. I will look at that as a ruling, because I think that might actually, pulling the two together might actually make that cover both what you and John were saying. Rhiannon?
Yeah, I know that it says sensitive in the environmentally sensitive area, but in addition to the habitats and species being rare or especially valuable, maybe adding or sensitive to, these impacts, because I think that that's what makes it an environmentally sensitive area, is that maybe those species or habitats are less able to, adapt to certain changes or activities.
Gotcha. Cameron?
My concern about this is just whether whether this definition is too vague. That is, it's not tied to anything, and maybe it's because in my work life we are often in court where there are fights over language that isn't specific enough to nail something down, and courts have to intervene. Hopefully that won't happen in this instance, but to just say that any area in which plant or animal life or their habitats are either rare or especially valued because their special nature or a role in an ecosystem or the ocean shore is really very vague. It's not tied to any standards or any law. It doesn't specifically mention things like the concept of keystone species and their prime role in any given environment. And I'm wondering if it would be better for the department to add to this definition some kind of anchor, whether from the Endangered Species Act or from the concept of keystone species or a definition of rare or something. This feels vague enough to me that it might cause problems down the line.
Thank you. Yeah, and I will, as I'm finishing up the permit decision standards, that's where this will be used, and I think that'll be really good feedback, because that's where I think we would iron some of that out, or maybe incorporate this more directly into that standard instead of as a standalone definition. So I will look at that. Thank you. Okay. Any other thoughts? Oh, Cameron, your hand's still up. I don't know if you have another comment. Felicia?
Yeah, so I was thinking more of maybe adding a definition. I know you wanted to reduce definitions, but
yeah.
I was just thinking, what about erosion? Because it's been mentioned in so many other definitions or through the different, documents you shared with us. I was just wondering if that might be a useful addition.
And I guess my question back to you, because I like that idea. I had never really thought of that. And I think it's because it's, we're just too close to the situation. We all know what erosion means. Um, so if it's not defined, the Merriam-Webster kind of standard definition becomes the default. And so I'm just wondering if there are some thoughts from your end on how we might want to clarify, what that means in a way that wouldn't necessarily be, duplicating what's a standard definition for it. And I think what I mean by that is things like if we wanted to kind of reiterate that, well, coastal, coastal processes naturally, remove and add materials along the coastline, and it can be exacerbated by, specific actions by human caused actions or activities. It can be, if there's some way that would make more sense to define what we mean by erosion, maybe. But if it's just the natural, wearing away of earth by natural processes, then I don't think we would need to define it. So I guess that's my question to you, Felicia. I like the idea, but I just want to have a little more context.
No, I think that's a good point. The reason why I was thinking about that is because also, as we mentioned, like the and that could go back to the definition also of like need, which I think we may need a definition of what needs is when you want to do those kind of projects. And I know there was some comment that, erosion is a natural process, and some people may be like, is it chronic? And it is a chronic issue, but some people may not understand that, like the over, like the what is that, like the scale, or either like that is like a chronic issue, or they may be a little confused. I mean, do we talk about erosion just coming from like storm surge and sea level rise wave action? Do we talk also like natural like bluff retreat that can be caused by also heavy precipitation or like improper drainage on the property? So I think there are different pieces there that maybe if we can be then specific when people also they might use that term thinking that, oh, erosion is happening, so we need to do something because this is a problem, but after without really understanding the causes of erosion that can come, like you said, from like other natural factors or from like, the current, human activities happening there that may like make these worse. So I think there is still a misunderstanding of what it is. I don't think we can cover it all with just a definition in that document, but at least maybe to be a little more like clear about what that means.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll play around with that. John?
Yeah, actually, I think that's a great idea from Felicia about how you put it in there. I don't know, but I know that from experience, ODOT has, and I don't know if it's a codified maybe in rule definition for erosion, but I know they have a definition of erosion that includes it in an event or in a scenario. So they'll say erosion is just from what I found, something to the effect of transportation of soil particles caused by water when construction related activities. But it also is as part of a broader management focus on preventing sediment from leaving a construction site. So that kind of a definition where you're saying it's this and it's contextually part of this. And if you link it into, when we talk about erosion, we're talking about erosion in context to a shoreline protected structure project or some other, ocean shore permitted activity. And that way you're specifically talking about the erosion occurring from the site, related to the site, if you want to, and then you can also like carve out maybe there's a natural erosion that we're talking about separately, that maybe we're not dealing with the natural erosion. Maybe we're doing something to fight the natural erosion, that kind of thing. But it is a word that's probably worth hitting on in the definition somehow, because it is a really relevant word to most of what we're talking about here. So that was my main thought. Oh, and they did have one other comment. It's where you have the definition of habitable dwelling.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's great. I just want to point out, it says means a house or structure that is fit for human occupancy. I hate to tell you this, but you know, I do this, right? This is like,
Mm-hmm.
that's a very subjective term, and there's a lot of things out there that are not, in my opinion, fit for human occupancy that absolutely meet the definition, legal
Mm-hmm.
definition of a dwelling. So I don't know if you want to think about that. And then you could reference, there's some links in building code. I'll see if I can get the right one.
Yeah.
I'll email it to you. So
Yeah, if you could, I did a bunch of mining through different rules, and it seems like the state likes to use multiple definitions.
yes.
And this is one. Thank you for pointing this one out, because this is one I actually meant to send over to Rhiannon to have to look at and refine, and it got lost in the shuffle too. But
No,
yeah,
you're
if you
right.
have any good definitions, because as you know, we're trying to get away from this. Hey, we can protect anything because it's on our property, to be more like, and using the term structure, using things like those, just are all so open-ended. And so yeah, I would love to have any thoughts on that. And Rhiannon, that goes for you too. If you have um, any thoughts, examples that actually define that, I would like to be consistent, not make up our own. But this was what I kind of meshed from about 3 different state rules that I found. So
Yeah, Kevin, I have compiled some, so we can talk offline about that for sure.
yes, please.
Thanks.
Sorry, I'm just making notes here real quick. All right, Diana.
Hey, so as far as the erosion, I really agree. There needs to be a definition of what erosion is. And in Washington's documentation, there's this repeating phrase, which is that erosion is a natural and beneficial process. And I would like to see something similar in our documentation. We hear about erosion and it's, the boogeyman and terrifying, and I think there needs to be more of an education and kind of like a baseline that
Mm-hmm.
it is a natural process and isn't just scary. I had a couple things about erosion that was down like in 62 and 65, so I'm happy to wait. Or since we're kind of in that discussion, I could make those points now.
So do they relate to specific definitions further down?
Yeah, it was on number 62 and number 65.
Yeah, let's wait till we get down there, just so I don't
Sure.
jump back and forth. And
Yeah, happy.
so I want to, and then I'll end up missing a definition or two. So
Yeah, okay.
and then if you when you make your comments, if you happen to have that phraseology from Washington, if
Yeah,
you could, or where it's found, that would be
Yeah.
great, because then I can put
Have
that in my
you-
notes too.
Have you taken a look at Department of Ecology Shoreline Master Program Planning
Mm-hmm.
Handbook?
I've looked at the rule, and I've looked a little bit at the handbook.
And then the Shoreline Permitting Manual for local governments?
I think so. I'm trying to remember the titles of them.
Okay.
I've looked at so many different
I will
things,
send
but
them to you and I'll pull some of that for you, okay?
sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Rhiannon, go ahead.
Yeah, if you are going to be adding erosion, I think it's important to add accretion as well.
That makes sense. And I think
Yeah,
we have a
I would
definition
just
of.
like to add to say that is really important. I'm dealing with some issues in, for example, Gerhardt, which has a huge accreted beach. I mean, it's just huge. You have to now make a major trek to get from the town out to the ocean. And there's a lot of things that go on in that area that are sometimes very difficult to track. So on the North Coast, there's more than one big accreted beach, thanks mainly probably to the Columbia River jetties. And I think it's important to include that process as well, because on some parts of the coast, it's a major player.
And Rhiannon, remind me, in the Dune Guide, did we create a definition for accretion?
I was just looking through that and I'm not seeing one for erosion. I haven't looked for accretion yet, but I can look for that. But everything is specific to erosion control measures, but not actually erosion.
Okay. All right. Yeah, well, let's work together on those two, because I think those would be important for the final dune management guide too. Just there, then we can have kind of a similar state definition, basically. So
Absolutely.
great. All right. Diana, did you have another comment? Nope. Megan.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that a lot of times in literature, when we talk about accretion of beaches, it's actually referred to as prograding shoreline, like a beach that's building out. So, yeah, I think accretion is often thought of as like a very local process. You have accretion on the toe of a dune, but if the entire beach is progressing into the sea, then it's a prograding shoreline, which adds to definitions, I realize.
No, I appreciate that. And maybe there's a way that we can have it kind of where it's accretion equals prograding to some extent. And because I think, yes, we might talk about accretion as being that localized, but I think generally speaking, we're talking about areas where either the coast is eroding or the coast is prograding, I guess is the best way to put it. So yeah, I think we're using them synonymously, but maybe not as precise or correctly as we should. Rhiannon?
Yeah, I think it's good to have definitions for these things, and that's fine. But I would just one thing that I'm thinking of is that if it's so prescriptive that you are boxing yourselves in for like any permitting decision, if it doesn't fit the exact definition, but it would be considered erosion, I just like keep that in mind when you're writing it so that it's not like 100% has to be this or it doesn't count.
Well, and I'm also thinking on some of these definitions, they may end up in some of more of our guidance. Because currently, I mean, I do use erosion in the rules of several times for like erosion control methods and those type of things, but I don't know that I've specifically called out accretion or some of those things. So I think you're absolutely right. We need to look at kind of how that fits in, but with the points noted. Okay. All right. Any other thoughts on this list? Otherwise, I'm going to jump ahead. And we can always go back if something jumps in your head. We need to go from there. So immediate and temporary measures we talked about during emergencies. Some of these other, same with them, imminent. This important habitats, this was another one that I had in there as a placeholder, kind of similar to the environmentally sensitive areas. This was the other option that I kind of had called out. This is the one I actually did put a note on it that was a placeholder for. And this might get at some of the thoughts that were brought up earlier, kind of getting back to those more specific elements, and maybe it's some combination. And this was modified from the territorial sea plan, but since we had the discussion on the environmental sensitive, I really wanted to kind of have the same dialogue here, see what your thoughts are between the two, and and if this seemed to be a better way to go, I guess. John, you had some good comments on the environmentally sensitive area. What are your thoughts on this important habitats?
So this is kind of easy for me because this is a lot of science coupled with a lot of case law and other law, and so I'm completely ignorant of, and not completely, but mostly ignorant of the important parts of this. So I look at it from the standpoint of
Mhm.
somebody who's just, how do I translate this to something I understand? It just seems like from the standpoint of trying to find a place that's important versus not important or less important,
Mhm.
or I think that's where I run into that one little hiccup where I would not know how to argue one way or the other, and I wouldn't know how to interpret the arguments one way or the other. I guess I would say there's something to be said about specific examples and details. So when you talk about an important habitat area, if you tell me there's snowy plovers or some other critter that runs around on the beach that we know it's endangered, we know they're rare, we're trying to protect them. Yeah, okay, that sounds like an important area. But how you define that area and those types of things. So, and for my part, this is where, leaning back into my experience, you usually map these areas out, you identify them ahead of time and say, look, these areas are important because of this level of information that we have based on this type of research that we did. And then if somebody comes along needing a permit to do some things, some type of development, they, we tell them, hey, this is a sensitive area over here. And I get the question, I know you do too. Well, how do you know that? Well, because of this process that had taken place. But there's still this problem where you have areas that for whatever reason haven't been identified, haven't been mapped, haven't been, and you never know until you find them through the process of a permit, where you realize it's like, well, if this was anywhere else, this would be fine. Unfortunately, there are certain sensitive, plant animal life here that we need to protect. How do we incorporate that into a permitting process in a way where if upon discovery we find something there that, hey, we need to do something about this, how do you do that? So again, it's really hard for me to give you a good response. Maybe I just know that mapped areas are definitely something I would lean on. That's kind of your first line of defense for protecting sensitive areas. Some mechanism in code, rule in this case, that says upon discovery we have to do something about this, but you have to be more detailed and talk about what those objective details are that you've discovered. You found some species, you can identify it on a list of endangered species, something like that. And something that takes the subjectivity out of it as much as possible, but also incorporates a procedural approach to identifying it. And I know, and I don't know exactly when, something like an EIS or something like that is required for a certain project or something like that. But I guess I would say that the two definitions, I like them. I think they're great. I just don't know exactly. I know you could try and incorporate them in a decision to do something based on some environmental situation. I just don't know how. I think it'll work most of the time. I don't know if it'll work all the time. So you may run into a situation where you lose a fight because of it. So those are that's my babbling thought on that.
No, that's fine. So I mean, so even though this one's a little more, I'll say specific, not prescriptive, it's similar issues as you're talking about, because it's still kind of leaving it open-ended. Okay.
It does reference threatened or endangered species, which I think is great. And it doesn't reference the bird of prey species for commercial recreational caught species. And there's some specificity to this that I think you could utilize. And the only thing I would say is I think you do need an or after somewhere between, or between C and D. I'd say you need an or there. I think that's more specific and I think that's useful. But I'm coming at this from an amateur standpoint, so I don't know if there's probably a lot of other things that need to be taken into consideration.
No, appreciate that. Alicia?
Yeah, also I'm not an expert at all on that topic, but by reading the definition of important habitats versus the environmental sensitive areas, at least the important habitats one, I feel like the being a little more detailed and specific what you're looking at is really helpful. But also I was wondering in the guidance document, in order to direct people, and especially if the department has, in mind like what they're looking for, what they would like to see. Is there any plan of like providing a list of resources or direct people like, related to important habitats? Here is where you find the information. Or if you know any existing resources, any existing tools that allow to identify those areas, I think it would be also helpful. I know everyone's, when they apply for a permit, supposed to do their homework, but still, I think really directing people in the right directions and then being a little more clear about what the expectations are would be good. And I think maybe also to identify like, also like the level of expectations. Is it something that, or even like you for the department, like related to the criteria, is it something that is going to be, what's the weight of that too? What do you weigh in when you're going to decide on a permit, on a project? How much is going to be influence, the decision or what they should do instead, or if they should go ahead when you think after again of mitigation measures, for example. So I think that now I'm like, going to more the details, but it's like things maybe to think of also like for the department, like to be basically comfortable with the decisions you're making, and also why you may reject a project, or why do you think some mitigation measures are acceptable or not based on how it's affecting those important habitats or sensitive areas.
Okay. And some of that would definitely be in the permit review standards, because again, this is just defining that term. But yeah, no, I appreciate that. That gives a lot more clarity. Thank you. Okay. Any other, let's see, any other thoughts on important habitats? Okay, so improvement. This is one, so just kind of going back, the definition of alteration, and this is a little bit circular definition, so I want to kind of make sure we all understand this. So in our statute, it actually says improvement, but then it also uses the term alteration and alter in parts of the statutes, but generally it's for improvements. And so we do have a definition of alteration that basically says alteration equals improvement. And so improvement then is being used here to really kind of define these core elements of what is an improvement and slash what is an alteration of the ocean shore. And so what I have done within this is tried to expand it to be a lot more inclusive. We used some very general terms in the past, which there are some benefits to that, but you start fighting. I'll just say with applicants, with attorneys, with everybody else, because it's like, well, example, filling of a portion of the ocean shore. Well, we didn't fill because we put something there and then we took it away. So we didn't actually fill it. Well, no. And so that's where adding in like even the temporarily, and the artificial means. It's like it's kind of one of these pieces where how do you define these things to kind of include all of those most likely scenarios. The other piece that we had is when the definition were incorporated from the Department of State Lands through a convoluted process. Filling and removal were also defined, but then they were based on the definition of materials, and it didn't include it. Like removal only said inorganic materials because that's what DSL's rules have, but yet our statute clearly includes removal of natural products, and it's broadly interpreted as natural products includes organic materials, and we do issue things like seaweed permits and other things where so it made it really really confusing. And when you looked at some of our other regulations, things like vegetation management, on the ocean shore, we regulate it in several different ways. But because of that one definition change, it made it a lot weaker for us. So what I've tried to do is take improvement to really be this one stop so that we can point things out. Again, there are some negatives to being more specific, but I think it is a lot clearer. But I'd love to get some thoughts on this definition and kind of the list that's here. John, go for it.
So FEMA's got a definition of improvement that literally covers it all. Anything that was human made, constructed, altered, that's their definition of development.
Okay.
Is what they call it. But development and improvement, I think we're talking about the same definition, even if they are two different words. But I would say FEMA's definition of development is probably the most comprehensive and inclusive, and it does eliminate anything that nature did. It's just that as if we did it, it's development, or I think in this case you could call it improvement. Yeah, I don't know if that's too encompassing or if that's
if you'd be able to share that with your comments, that would be appreciated, or send it to me by email, however, if you've got it, that would be great, because I can take a look at that and see if I can steal some, repurpose it some way, shape, or form.
I'm gonna comment up on this Word file that I have, and then I'll email it back to you. Okay, perfect. I'll do that. Okay.
Yeah, you can also on the Google document with Katie's gonna make live here soon. We can also do it there.
I might, I will try and do that. And I'm not 100% sure I can do that from my computer, but I think I can find a way. So one way or the other, I'll get that to you. So okay.
Yeah, and the Google, so I don't have a Google account at work, and I was able to go in and make some edits. I tried that this morning, and so it is basically view and edit. You don't need a Google account. It just puts you under anonymous.
Perfect. Perfect. Okay, I should be able to do that then. Okay, good to know. Thanks.
And the document is there now, so should have access.
Thank you, Katie.
Excellent. Thank you, Katie.
Okay, so the other one I wanted, does anybody else have any thoughts on improvement before we move on? Okay. The other one I had kind of a question on, and it was related to the infrastructure piece. As we talked about kind of with the emergency, this is one of those things that ends up kind of always being a dialogue, because our definition of infrastructure and other people's definition of infrastructure is not always the same. And so trying to kind of very clearly pull out that when we talk about upland infrastructure, we talk about the habitable dwelling, ocean fronting roads, highways, electrics, and all this utilities, I should say, and then authorized alterations that existed before 67, and that is a pulling in our reference from statute and then kind of clarifying what is not in there. And that's things, as we look through kind of the totality of goal 18 and a few other things, it's the road ends, it's driveways, private sidewalks, and things of just kind of these landscaping features, and some of these other structure that is not really, within that upper definition or inherently included in that upper definition. So I want to know if anybody has any thoughts on that or any issues kind of with how that's framed. Megan.
Yeah, I was just curious when the last piece of this definition says, or any structure or alteration that is located on the ocean shore as a result of erosion. So does that mean that you could, if there was a big storm event, something may have been considered infrastructure before the event, and then after the event, it's no longer considered infrastructure if it eroded back far enough?
Hold on. So I think that's a good question. I'll talk about that with the team because that might be language issue with the language. The intent on some of that was I'll say we get a lot of things that end up on the ocean shore, whether or not they failed or they were just exposed, and I'll use the example of you build an upland um, uh, shoreline protective structure. You put in some sheet pile at your foundation 50 feet from the ocean, and now it's been exposed. It's still a viable structure, right? Well, it was never a permitted ocean shore structure. Um, and if something fails and ends up on the ocean shore, obviously then that's going to be a rebuild or whatever, and you're not necessarily looking at it from that framework. But it does bring up an interesting point that I appreciate you pointing out. Like, yeah, if it erodes and fails, I'll use an example of something we had not that long ago where some cables got exposed, some north-south cables got exposed. That would be an interesting question because we also have a prohibition for using the ocean shore as a north-south utility corridor. And so once it's exposed on the ocean shore, how is it then dealt with? And so, yeah, I think there probably needs to be a little clarity on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that is the question then. Is it still considered infrastructure? In this definition, it says it would be no, but
Yeah.
I think if if it was a cable, a telecom cable, for instance, and there's a lot of value in keeping that around, then should it still be considered infrastructure?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Yeah, and I think this was that when I wrote that, I was looking at more of those, I'll say those things that were constructed, whether it's an access way, walkway, and now it's on the ocean shore. There's some of those types of things that have kind of, I'll say, migrated versus the failure piece of where, something is still functioning, but it's now on the ocean shore when it shouldn't have been or wasn't intended to be. But yeah, let me talk with the team and see how we can't kind of reframe that and to be clear. Okay. All right. Any other thoughts on the eyes? Okay. And we'll move down. All right. So the big one that's here in front of everybody. So our jurisdictional line is based on the line of established upland shore vegetation. And we're internally still going to be talking about this, but I wanted to bring kind of three options to this group to see if there was any thoughts, pros, cons on kind of which direction we head with this. So the first one that I have outlined there as option one, and well, let me back up. so line of established vegetation is our farthest inland jurisdictional boundary for. So as a reminder, we have the extreme low water line, which is demarcating our western boundary. We have the ordinary high tide line, which demarcates the state's ownership boundary. We then have the statutory vegetation line that was the surveyed line for a portion of the coast that was done back in 67, 68. And then we have the line of upland vegetation, which is can be either east or west of the statutory vegetation line, but when it's east, that becomes our easternmost boundary of the ocean shore. So it's an extremely important definition for us to get right. Pre-99, when Department of State Lands had it, and I put this in one of the comments, it was a very simple. It meant the point along the ocean shore where the vegetation cover becomes continuous, right? There's some greatness in how simple that is, but it also leaves a lot of questions on like how do you figure that out. After 99, we had a little more substantive definition, and that's what option 1 is representing, except for in the middle of it, it had this term of where minor gaps, breaks, or landward indentations in the line of continuous vegetation occur, the projected line across the cannot speak, sorry. You project the line across the gap. What we've kind of had some discussions with contractors and attorneys is trying to take that and say, well, specifically one area, 500 feet indentation was a minor gap when you look at it on the perspective of the coastline, which, okay, I can see that argument. So what I did is I went back and I looked at the statutory vegetation lines, kind of trying to get back to that original intent, and identified that we actually have a couple of statutory vegetation line points that are about 25 feet apart. And so using that, trying to define that where those minor gaps, breaks, or landward indentations that are less than 25 feet, then we go straight across. If they're greater, then we basically follow the same continuous kind of the line around that. So that's kind of the simple fix, right? It's trying to keep it the same, which has been working. It's not really broken. Is it as precise as it could be? No. Does it give us as much ability to kind of maybe develop things in guidance? Maybe. So then when we were talking, kind of came up with an option 2 and 3, which are built off the same model. Basically, that model is the definition is rebuilt to clearly define that this is that line that defines the dynamic beach portion and the stable upland portion, and it's based on field indicators, and that's really kind of the way to frame it. And so using that for the basis of 2 and 3, the differences between 2 and 3 are, one, the option 2 is basically laying it out as that is the definition of it's that line between the dynamic and stable, and it's based on field indicators. And then the rest of that would be done in guidance. We would take the elements that are under option 3, A through E, and those would get moved to guidance. Option 3 is taking that more objective criteria and kind of pieces that I'll say questions that often come up when we're out in the field, and really tried to be specific within the rule about that. And so it is really defining those elements. And I'm going to use something, it was common one that's out there, and I like to call it the Pacific City kind of situation where, and that's number D, in option 3. And it's like where in the case of Pacific City, there are large stretches where there is no vegetation west of the homes. And in some cases, there's not even vegetation until the other side of the street, past maybe the first or second row of homes. So by that option one definition, you could read that to mean that the ocean shore is actually east of those homes. We don't believe that was the intent of the legislature, and nor is it something that we want to try to get engaged in, because that would mean those were unlawfully constructed homes on the ocean shore. And so trying to use something like that to basically define that, hey, when the sand runs up and it's unvegetated sand runs up, we're going to basically say it's up to the foundation because there is nothing else there. Part of that is it helps define the it helps us support discussions with the applicants and the landowners of it's actually in your interest to revegetate these dunes, because then we go away and you only have to deal with the county. And so that's what some of this stuff is trying to get to. We also have like a parking lot that is there in Pacific City that again, there's no vegetation until past the parking lot, and we've had some dialogue of, well, is the parking lot actually on the ocean shore, because there is no vegetation. So again, trying to really make sure that we're calling that out. Hopefully that makes sense where we're going. So I guess my question for this group is, between those three options, is there a preference or concern with any of those options that I can kind of take as feedback when we refine this as internally? Cameron.
Yeah, hi. This is always the most confusing part of coastal stuff. I mean, everybody agrees you get to this material and it's just like, how do you define something that's moving every second of every minute and make it stick, so to speak? So I'm going to bring up again the issue that I've been dealing with lately about accreted beaches, because there are areas, Gerhardt's the most obvious, but it's not the only one, where there's not just local accretion like around the edge of a headland, but a whole vast area is being heavily accreted, and the beach is growing, and the beach meadows, to use a term that I've seen in the literature, which are vegetated, are also growing. So the beach itself is growing, but so is the vegetated business behind it. So the town is farther and farther and farther away from the beach. And my understanding is, if I have that right, is that a whole accreted area is under state law owned by the state. But I'm not sure. I guess my question would be, are the permits that we're thinking about in this division related to accreting areas like that, or only the actual ocean shore, from the vegetation line out to the sea?
So I'll use, just because I'm more familiar with it, I mean, and I know that that whole Clatsop Plain area. Our jurisdiction line is to the statutory vegetation line in that area, per the way the statute and current definition of the line of established shore vegetation all works out. But the way the statute puts it, it's whichever one is further east. And so in the Clatsop Plain area, including Gearhart, you're going to have the statutory vegetation line being that eastern boundary. As we know, the actual line of established vegetation would be west of that, in some cases, I'll say up to a quarter mile.
Yeah, sometimes it is that. In some
it,
places in the
it,
Clatsop Plains, it is that far.
And so that is how the current statutory definition has everything laid out, because it does say the state's jurisdiction is to the surveyed SVL or the line of established, whichever is further inland. And so yes, this definition would still apply in those areas, but it becomes less relevant because it's not actually being used to define our jurisdiction. The statutory vegetation line would be defining our jurisdiction.
Okay.
If that makes
that sort of makes sense. I mean, I've gone over this problem so many times over the years, and it always seems to not make sense. No matter how many times I go over it, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and we can talk about that offline. If you have a specific project area that you're working on, we can talk offline about where is our jurisdiction in that area.
Okay.
But yeah,
I
it's
guess
like I said,
what I want to do is figure out the Clatsop Plains area seems to be the part of the coast that's accreting the most. Other parts are eroding heavily. But the whole Clatsop Plains area is doing the reverse. So I guess I want to make sure that we choose whichever one of these three options makes it clearest that the ocean shore is dynamic, and sometimes it erodes and sometimes it accretes and sometimes it doesn't do much, or it does it just on an annual basis, so you end up more or less in the same place. And I'm not sure which definition is the best one. I'm a little leery of option 3 personally because it's so detailed, and my experience with the ocean shore is the more you try to pin details on it, the more it escapes your details. And I'm just wondering if something kind of simpler, like maybe option 2, is better because it sets a framework, but allows you to do the research. The line is based on the totality of documentable field indicators, including various things. So it gives you the flexibility to do the research in a particular situation that might not fit into the details of option 3.
okay, thank you.
If that makes sense.
Absolutely. Okay, hold on one second here. All right. Let's see. So anybody, let's see. Oh, Megan.
Yeah, I guess I personally sort of like some of the specifics of the third definition, but I see where Cameron's coming from. So I wonder if they can be stated in some way that these are considerations that are considered. I did use the same word twice, sorry. Like considerations that state parks um, looks into when thinking about where the line is, but there's still some margin of being able to use best judgment, like Cameron was saying. But also, my other comment is the 25 feet. I don't know how strict that is, and what if it's 26 feet? You know, is that going to make a problem for whoever, or is it more just like a guideline of it can't be like a really long stretch? But yeah.
Yeah, that's always kind of a problem with these numbers, and generally we've moved away from using numbers like that because we've seen the problems. Like, I mean, I think the geo reports before was, if it was more than 50 feet. Well, if you have 49 feet and you're doing something, you can have just as much effect as if you are doing 200 feet, or you might actually have less effect if you're doing 200 feet and it's connecting to existing revetments. So how do you frame that? So we've tried to remove a lot of those. So I understand where you're coming from, but part of it is, again, it's how specific do you get, or do you, again, pull it out and have that more as guidance based? And so but definitely appreciate that feedback. John, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a comment about the 25 feet, and I don't know, I see Tyler's hands up too. He might be thinking along the same lines. I'm kind of thinking, and sorry, this is a little, I don't know, it's a little dark, but I deal with this stuff. The problem with lineal feet is property owners will get out there with a shovel or a piece of equipment, and they'll alter the landscape to get what they want. And so I like to I like the idea that there's no one metric for determining that line. And I agree. I love the detail of option 3. I do agree with Cameron that those guidelines need to be. I think having having a process and a guidance document for that process might be safer, better, maybe defendable, more defendable in certain circumstances. But yeah, it's just determining where that line of vegetation is. Yeah, I would have a hard time with that too. But I don't like certain types of metrics that would open the door to somebody going out, property owner or contractor, somebody going out and literally altering the ocean shore to move that line on you or something like that. And I mean, the issue would be they wouldn't remove the grass. They wouldn't want to move the line any further east. That would, well, I don't know. Maybe they would. I wouldn't want to say that necessarily. And I don't know how they would, like, you'd see a carpet of seagrass out there that just plopped up in the middle of the night. I don't know where it would come from. Who knows? And that kind of thing. But I think that's my only thought about the 25 feet. It's just that there's literal metrics like that. Like, I can see people messing with landscape for that. That's it. So.
And I appreciate that. And that's part of why in option 3 there becomes that definition of artificial or non-natural gaps, is because then it's trying to get at that. Because that is something that we were looking at. And in fact, we have one permit a couple permits that Tyler and I were looking through, where we basically called natural coves that were, around, I'll say, the Depot Bay area, and that were, it's a very dynamic coastline, and there's little pocket beaches and that. And we basically said, yeah, you can fill the cove because it's not on the ocean shore because it's a minor gap. And it's like, but wait, that is on the ocean shore. That's a natural feature of the ocean shore. It's not but we were calling it minor gap, even though it was natural. So yeah, there's some things like that I think start lending it to and again, even with the 25 feet, it is a slippery slope. And so yeah, you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? Tyler, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of appreciate John's point about, what keeps somebody from just coming out there with a truckload of sod and, rolling out, a couple strips of sod in front of their property and then being like, well, I'm not on the ocean shore anymore. I'm absolved of this issue. Out to maybe the statutory vegetation line. So that is an interesting point. I was going to try to address something that Cameron was saying, though. I think what we're trying to do here is nail down really like a better way of defining like kind of something that's already like kind of good and just make it a little better here. Because we're not going to be able to fix the issue like in Clatsop Plain through this definition, because really the line in practicality on the ground would effectively stay in the same place, if that makes sense. Like the line wouldn't move because we changed the definition. When you think about up there at Clatsop Plain, Gearhart, whatever, Delray area, we just want to sort of eliminate the excuses and remove the ambiguity of what does minor gaps or breaks mean. Is that 25 feet? Is that 50 feet? Is that 100 feet? Because we have had areas where, like 50 feet, depending on who takes a look at the site, starts to kind of be the question where we sort of scratch our heads a little bit, but Kevin, I think like you pointed out, there are locations where the original statutory vegetation line was measured and there were points as close as 25 feet. So we kind of have that as a precedence. So just something, I guess, for you guys to sort of think about when it comes to, sort of nailing down this, because this is like this is one of the most important controlling lines as it relates to our jurisdiction. And it's how we use enforcement, how we determine whether or not something needs a permit, et cetera. So I'm just trying to give that additional context there. So appreciate y'all's input.
Tyler, your hand's still up. Any other thoughts on line of established upland shore vegetation? And even if you don't really have an answer, any thoughts or even just, hey, I like option whatever. I'm very much Felicia.
Yeah, me, I kind of like option 3, but so I like sometimes more details. But again, if it's going to be part of the guidance document, I think it's okay to then go with option 2. But then in this case, maybe make a note saying like for more information on the process or something like that, refer again to this guidance document. But because like you mentioned, it's like so important, I would say it might be worth to put more details there. Um, that's, but yeah, I understand also other comments about that, but that's where I would go.
Megan.
I just was curious about any people who are lawyers in this group, like what they would think about the definitions, since I think this is, like Tyler was saying, a very important line for Oregon. So
Yeah, and we will be running this by our council. I just, like I said, this is more of because we're considering changing it, kind of getting feedback from this group on like, do we want to be more specific? Does this even seem to kind of target that? Are there other options? I guess that was something I didn't bring up at the beginning, if anybody has ideas, but you're absolutely right. No, this is something we need our legal counsel to look at because it is 3/4 of our coast is using this definition for our jurisdictional boundary. Any other thoughts, Megan? Sorry, I kind of cut you off.
that's fine. I guess one other thought is, instead of saying continuous vegetation, it might be worth talking to one of the ecologists and asking them if there's a definition that they would use to define continuous, like based upon percent cover. I don't know if that, yeah, I'm not sure if that's helpful or not.
Do you think somebody like Sally or somebody else might actually have something that we could
Yeah,
refer some
Sally definitely has data for the last 20 years on, and like has a pretty good idea of what she would define as continuous, or
Mhm.
high density vegetation based upon percent cover or stem count.
Okay. I'll reach out to Sally on that. Okay, thank you. All right. Okay, last call for line of vegetation. All right, moving down. The let's see. The other ones I kind of had question on with this group is, first off, I wanted to look at natural product. This is a very specific term related to natural product removal. It is the first time it's been defined, and I think I got it where I wanted to be. But basically, under our statutes, we have 2 standalone statutes that one is for pipelines and cables, one is for natural product removal. In reality, we do not do natural product removal as I guess I'll say was originally intended, which from what I can tell was there was a lot more mining and other types of operations. under these new rules, we're basically considering all of those under the same review standards. We're not separating them out into additional processes. But what I wanted to do for the purposes of when we call out natural products, because there is that one provision in statute, I wanted to make sure that it covered basically those opportunities where it is being, where the and have been trying to kind of get a better hold of is when the ocean shore is used as a commodity within a project. So it may not be getting removed fully from the ocean shore. An example of this would be tow trench is dug, revetment is put in, and then the beach is basically scalped and all of the sand is put on top of the revetment and then vegetated. And that is commoditized, basically making it a commodity of the sand. It is using that within the structure, because to bring it in, there would have been a cost to that. And so trying to kind of clearly define that really natural product, and then also the association of natural product removal is going to include any of these materials where there is a value being put on it, whether it's commercially sold or being used for a personal purpose. So that's what I was trying to get at, but I'd love to get some feedback on that. If that's the right way to go with it, is this the right way to define this? Is there another thought process on that? Because this is kind of a very, very niche definition. And if you don't have any thoughts, that's okay too, but I just wanted to open it up and see. Okay, well, oh, Felicia?
I just have a question related to, it'd be interesting to see in the rules where the natural product is used or mentioned in that rule, because right now it's hard for me to to give feedback on that definition then, but I get it. But in this case, like for example, natural product would just be even like sand that has been, yeah, okay. But yeah, I was just curious then to see where it will be in the rulemaking. But maybe I have to do some digging about that.
Yeah, and so it's not a big portion of our rules, because as I said, it's an allowance in statute, but by default we haven't been doing anything, nor has really anybody been asking to do anything. I don't think it would be consistent with our review criteria in most cases to do like mining of the beach, but there may be cases in the future where we decide that some area has too much sand and we need to move an area without sand or something. Well, that could be viewed that way, where you're could be an opportunity where this would be included. So it's being included, but as a minor element now. I think it's probably the best way to put it. Tyler, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most common examples or requests that we get are driftwood, like trying to incorporate driftwood into some sort of structure, and like the seaweed. I think recently we got a request for some sort of seaweed collection to be used. And there are like a couple of like not full blown, I want to say gold mining operations, but like this mechanized removal of, we're looking for gold and gold panning and things like that. So that would be the context that we would be using, like most of these. That's how we would be addressing it, to Felicia's kind of question, I guess.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to take a quick break here. And when we come back, we'll have probably a more in-depth discussion, because we'll be starting on the nature-based solutions and non-structural erosion control, which were discussion at the last last meeting. So, Katie, how long a break do you want to take?
Let's come back at 5 to 3. So we'll do a 10-minute break ish, 12-minute break. So 5 minutes to 3.
Sounds great.
Okay, is everyone back? Are you ready, Kevin, to continue?
I am ready when everybody else is. All right, so we'll get going here. So the definitions, the last two on this slide are two that we kind of touched on last time. They are a first go round of um, trying to develop definitions for both nature-based solutions and non-structural erosion control. They're probably going to be they will be tweaked a little bit. We've had some additional discussion. Been working with Rhiannon at the LCD to try to come up with what hopefully can be more of a mutually acceptable definition here. And basically, with the definitions, so we've defined nature-based solutions, we've defined non-structural, and we've defined structural erosion control. And so kind of looking at that broader broader definition framework within that. And basically, nature-based solutions is trying to get at it is these natural process mimicking structures, but it can be structural or non-structural. And I'm going to be blunt. There's a portion of the beginning of this that we may adjust a little bit to be much clearer about that it can be structural or non-structural. That's kind of the end of that first sentence of that nature-based, but that's the intent, is that this is a technique that includes non-structural and structural elements, and then obviously non-structural and structural are defined. So I just wanted to kind of frame that out. So in particular, Megan, I would love to have your thoughts on this definition for nature-based, since you've been working around these more directly, but then again, the rest of the group as well, just to see, am I even heading down the right path, or are there other resources or tools that we could use, examples of this that are out there? Because I did do some work online to try to pull together some different definitions to something that would work better for what we were looking for. But yeah, would love to get the feedback so we can refine this, because this is a first draft of it.
I do have some thoughts, but I'm just rereading them, and then
Okay,
I'll so just give me a minute.
no worries.
Other people can talk up or speak up.
Anybody else want to provide some thoughts on this one? What about non-structural while Megan's still looking at her notes? Well, I guess Megan,
So yeah,
you're up, Megan.
sorry. So well, I'll also send you my email with notes, but
Absolutely.
I think one word that we do use a lot is resilience, and then the question is like, what does resilience mean? So I think it might be better to be more specific about, instead of using the word resilience, like what does state parks consider or want to consider, like enhancing the capacity of the coast for increasing coastal protection, or like what are the ecosystem services, I guess, that are valued by state parks? Do you guys have an answer for that? Coastal protection is probably one.
I mean,
But
yeah,
yeah.
that's an interesting framework on that, because I would say, if you look at our mandate, it's the natural, I'll just say the natural processes, a natural ecological. But when you look at the social pressures, it is the shoreline protection side. And so I think if we're going to be shifting from structural to non-structural elements and encouraging these, then I think having naturally available shoreline protection would probably be where I would say we'd have to lean, because it's kind of, you almost have to have that in order to meet the other ones that we want. We can't, otherwise it becomes a this versus that, because we know the coast is eroding, and eventually you're going to have houses on the beach which aren't good for environmental or other considerations there. So
Okay. My other question was, when you say nature-based methods use naturally available materials, vegetation, and natural structures, I know from just talking with folks up at the Akola Creek project, it still has to be something that's dynamic, right?
Well, and that's the difference between why nature-based is a technique that can be structural or non-structural. And that's one of the
Okay.
reasons why I said that first line, we're going to have to, I have it in there, but it's not as explicit as it needs to be. Because then you kind of have three elements, right? Non-structural is more of an umbrella, or sorry, nature-based is more of an umbrella, versus kind of gray infrastructure, that side of things, where then you still have non-structural or structural erosion control. So if you go in and use all natural elements, but you make it static and structural, then it's a structural technique. If you make it dynamic and deformable, then it would be a non-structural technique. It'd be a non-structural nature-based technique,
I
right?
see. Okay.
So that's kind of the it is definitely a nuance, and it's something that by having the three definitions we're trying to get at. Like I said, I don't think that we have the harmony yet.
Yeah. So if someone came to and like filed a permit and said they wanted to do a nature-based solution, then would they also need to define whether it was non-structural or structural as well? Or
Yes. I mean, that's going to
okay.
be part of the application, part of the project description is, are you using, is it dynamic, is it static, is it nature-based, or is it gray? I mean, that's kind of going to be the core elements of where you do. And as you see on some of the diagrams I've done, it'll probably be where are you at on that spectrum, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
you could come in and say, hey, we're goal 18 eligible. We want to put in toe rock, toe armor against the toe of the slope, and then we want to come back out and we want to create a, dynamic revetment with vegetated dune on top of that. Well, okay, so that's still nature based, but there's structural elements. It's still softer than if you just came in and said, I want to build a 60-foot revetment, tall revetment, or 60-foot wide revetment out there, right? So that's where it goes on that spectrum, and that's where we'd be looking at it. But what we're trying to do is get better to where it's like the more you can work with the natural and ecological processes, the more you're going to fall into this nature based, and the more dynamic you can make it, the more you're going to fall into the non-structural. Because part of what we're also trying to do with these definitions is that these nature-based and non-structural can be solutions for those who are not goal 18 eligible. And that is something that I guess I'll say we're not necessarily encouraging, but right now I think there's a lot of kind of a perception that you're either goal 18 and you get riprap or you don't get anything. And that's some of the landowners' perspective and the contractors that are out there. And so trying to be able to be clearer that no, there is actually this continuum and it exists.
Okay. I wonder if well, maybe this will go somewhere else in the rules, but I wonder if some of that should be, and I missed the last meeting, unfortunately. I will, sorry about that. I think I
No worries.
emailed you about it. Is the process of deciding whether your approach is non-structural versus structural brought up somewhere else in all these review rules? Or like if someone's filing for a permit, do they know those differences?
So in the rule, we do both in their application and then also in our review standards or the permit decision, there is going to be reference to the nature-based versus structural versus non-structural. And that there is kind of a preference for nature-based and there's a preference for non-structural, those kinds of things. So that is included in there. We will end up having more or improved guidance to applicants. That's part of why we were talking about in some of the last meetings is why I really would like to have project-specific criteria as well, where we kind of take all of these and coalesce them into a set of rules that says, hey, if you're doing shoreline protection, here's some very specific things that you have to meet and consider. That may be our second state of rulemaking, but then also having the guidance along that with it's like, okay, hey, when you come in and you have this problem, here's where you need to start looking, right? And it starts at move your house back if, and I'm assuming shoreline stabilization, you have some sort, right? Shoreline erosion control. It's like, well, first thing you got to do is move your house back. Second thing is you need to see if there are some natural process or nature-based solutions that you can look at. You also need to look at whether you're Goal 18 eligible or not. And again, there's being able to define that much better for the applicants and help them understand what kind of doorways they have available to them and what order they have to open those doors and go through them before they go to the next one. That's going to be a lot of what I think is going to happen in the guidance because that's the only way it's going to be really easy to digest some of what's fairly technical in the rules.
I guess another question I had was about the term here, like or enhance natural ecology and functions. I know that there's a preference to go back towards native species. However, the Oregon coastline is, proliferated by invasive grasses, and so nature-based is still could be using grasses even though they're not native. I'm just wondering the stance on that. Does it need to be natural, or is it just, what are you guys thinking there?
Well, I'll say my intent writing it was not to be that prescriptive because I think in some of the areas we've identified like non-invasive and some of those but there's also a slippery slope because beach grass can also be looked that way. Mm-hmm. But it's as you and I have talked multiple times, right? It's the reality is unless there was a statewide effort, and even if that happened, we probably wouldn't get rid of it, right? It is a part of our coastline, whether we like it or not, until enough money or technology comes around to do something about it. So yeah, I don't think the intent was to exclude things like, hey, well, I incorporated beach grass into it, and now, well, that's not natural. I mean, it really is by default a natural element of our coast now. And it provides flood benefits and other things. I mean, and as a state, we've already acknowledged some of those things. So, and dune stabilization in those areas where we've developed in the dunes. So,
okay. Well, I can
yeah.
send you some of my wording.
Absolutely.
Yeah, stuff.
Rhiannon, I just wanted to ask and see if your comments, if you wanted to respond back to any of the questions Megan had too before I went
I'll just
to John.
add quickly, just for context for the group for nature-based solutions, one of our goals was also to move away from the new definition that the Corps came up with for nature-based solutions. That was essentially if you have one piece of a natural product or material, it would count as a nature-based solution. So you could have a riprap revetment and then have like one piece of grass, and that would count basically as nature-based solutions. And so we were trying to avoid that completely and have it be very clear that it has to be majority nature-based materials as well. So that was one of our main goals. Thanks.
Okay, John.
I think Rhiannon just answered my question because I'm reading the definitions and I'm thinking, can you get away with doing this without actually doing anything with a natural, any kind of grass or anything like that? But I kind of see the point here, and yeah, I think that's it. It just seems like you could do. It says, design to mimic, enhance, or integrate with nature and natural processes for term resilience. I don't see any percentages. It says nature-based methods are naturally available materials, vegetation, natural structures, natural processes to absorb wave energy. Is somebody going to come along and argue that a revetment of basalt rock is essentially a natural nature-based solution. I mean, that's kind of, I mean, I know that's probably the argument that's the most obvious and probably the one you're most prepared for, but it's just, is that, you know, and then you get into structure and, you know, was it designed, engineered, et cetera. I think that solves some of that, but I guess that was my question. So
Yeah, and that that was actually something brought up. We had a few of us were talking about this a couple days ago, and I think one of the recommendations that I don't have in here, but it's the naturally available kind of going more naturally available materials versus natural, because yeah, you can go, well, a boulder's natural. But it's more of tying it back to what is naturally available on on that stretch of coastline, or generally on the Oregon coast or something like that, to where it will allow those dynamic revetments. It'll allow those other things that are more nature based, and not just going, well, yeah, once in a while there's a rock slide on the coast and it has big boulders, so we're just going to emulate a rock slide, and that's what we're going to do here. So yeah, trying to get back to that. How do you do it as a naturally available?
I think that's where I was going, and I think I think the definition is, you've done better than I could. I don't know what else you could do there. I think it's more descriptive criteria when you start this, you know, taking in an application and they say, well, this is a nature-based solution. If you have a set of criteria that you can apply, that doesn't necessarily have to be at the OER level, I suppose, just something that says, well, you know, here are the things we're actually looking for. And then but you want to give yourself a little flexibility there. I also think, I don't know, I've observed that when you try and implement a process, you give it a little while, take a few applications and see what surfaces, and then you can start screening out some of the obvious, there are loopholes basically, or you know, little detail areas where people slide stuff through. But that's tough. I'm not quite sure how you approach that. But yeah, everybody wants to argue a boulder is a natural thing, and they're not wrong. But if you did craft it out of a quarry with a large excavator, that's not exactly the natural we're looking for. So yeah, that's my
I
thoughts.
appreciate it. Thank you. Diana?
Yeah, I really appreciate the points that Rhiannon and John just made, because, you know, I've sat through those meetings too, where people say that their riprap is, you know, the ecologically best choice. But back to something that Megan brought up, I think it's nice if you can begin the definition with the purpose. And when I was looking at this, I pulled up the Union for Conservation of Nature and the UN's definition of nature-based, and it's nature-based solutions are actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, while simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So I think because for a lot of people this is new, it would be nice if there was, I'm not saying this is, you know, the perfect thing, but if there was some description of why or what the benefit is. And then I really like the idea of having some sort of percentages or a more granular definition of what your total project needs to accomplish to fall into that basket of nature-based.
Yeah, and if you have copies of those, I didn't come across those in my research. I'm trying to remember where I grabbed mine from. I think it was a couple of federal agencies that I was looking at, the non-Corps of Engineers federal agencies. But yeah, I didn't look at some of the international examples. So if you have some of those, I'd be willing to look at those, because as I said, I've kind of taken some of these and cherry picked to try to get it to more of what I understand where we're wanting to go. And some of the other ones, like, when you look at some of these definitions for, say, the Gulf Coast, well, they generally cover, but they're talking about restoring, wetlands and shoals and coral reefs, and it's like, well, we don't have those things here, and so how do you take those and merge them? So yeah, I'd be willing to look at any other definitions you have. So if you have examples of those, please provide them.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, Megan.
Just based upon Rhiannon's like wanting to get away from people putting riprap on the coast and then saying it's natural, maybe it might be worth also having a definition for hybrid, if that's something that Oregon even wants to think about. But hybrid structures where there is an element of encouraging nature-based, but it's not completely 100% feasible. Then there's a mix of nature-based and more structural elements. And then the other piece I was going to bring up is a lot of nature-based solutions are meant to be dynamic in some way. So possibly having dynamic in the definition would be helpful. Like the grass is supposed to be able to move in the wind. If you put cobble on the out there for a dynamic revetment, it's supposed to move around in the waves. Instead of just saying in the definition here, it says stabilize soil, and I don't think we're 100% trying to do that. We're just trying to encourage natural accretion, but not necessarily putting a big boulder out there that doesn't move.
Yeah, and I think and going back to kind of with your hybrid, and I like that idea, and I think even in our application materials, that section we looked at last week, we kind of say it, but we don't say hybrid. But I think you might be right, because we do talk about hybrid in like the erosion control guide that was DLCD published in 21. I think it was 21, 22. I can't remember when it came out, but that might not be a bad way, because I think kind of going back to your one comment about the dynamic versus static, is that's supposed to be what's kind of in that non-structural, structural, and then the dynamic could cover that, and then nature-based is kind of that umbrella that those would go under, is saying how do we incorporate natural elements. So it's almost a different leg, where yes, we put in some structural that's not nature based, but then we put in some non-structural that is nature based. And or the other side of it is, hey, instead of a rock revetment, we came in and we're going to do a log crib structure that is non-deformable, but we're doing it on a nature-based, effectively, I'll call it log jam, driftwood, of that nature, where it is not really as structure than, if you just went out and put a stacked pile of rock. So I think there's a way of doing that, but I do think that I'll work with Rhiannon on that and trying to kind of morph those three and adding in that hybrid and see how that might work, because the hybrid might also help the application materials, and as we're talking about mitigation, and being able to kind of say like, well, you can go from avoid to nature-based, non-structural to nature-based, dynamic, or hybrid to nature-based structural to non-nature-based structural or something. So we're kind of being able to in guidance more clearly define that as, this is what we mean by these things, because I think you're absolutely right. I think the coastline is very ripe for hybrid structures. Fully nature-based, we might have, I think we have some opportunities for it, a lot more than we've been giving it, non-structural, but these hybrids may be really the sweet spot that kind of hopefully does both or meets both standards. So I like that idea. I'll take a look at it. Okay. Diana? Oh, Felicia?
Yeah, actually, I agree with Megan. I was going to suggest that as well, and for like the hybrid. between structural and non-structural and having an hybrid option. I like that. Also, going back to the point that Megan made earlier in the definition of nature-based solutions related to the term resilience. I think if you want to keep that term in the definition, it would be helpful to actually define that term. So that would be adding, another definition. I think it would be helpful to define that. And after, I just wanted to add as well, because we're like in alphabetical order, so I don't know after anyone else had more feedback on those definitions, but otherwise, to stay in the alphabetical order, I was thinking something that has been mentioned last time under like the last document reviewed for the rules was like having maybe a definition for need when we talk about project need. So what does it mean? I think it would be helpful to maybe add that. And also, I know it's well defined into the document as well, like mitigation measures, but I think maybe it might be good to also add, because it's like in the rule, to maybe add another definition related to mitigation, maybe. So these are just suggestions.
Okay. Let me make a couple notes here, make sure I don't lose those. Yeah, and I think the need, project need portion of it, when we get to the review standards, I think you'll find that that's more or less worked out in there, because I did make it fairly specific. It's like these are the elements that make up that we have to find or shown in the application, basically. And I know we didn't get a chance to look at those, but just kind of throwing that out there.
Okay.
But if not, I think that's a good point to define it, and that may be another way to handle that. Okay. And then, all right. So non-structural erosion control. Any thoughts on that definition? Great. We nailed it. We can, like I said, we can come back up to these two if you have any thoughts. So moving down the O's, really the only one I planned on kind of mentioning was owner, mainly because this is a new structure. I actually took this from or adapted it from one of the SHPO rules. Actually, there was some similar ones to it out there, but this one seemed the most applicable to us, and kind of shortened it as they had a lot more specifics in it. But again, trying to get back to who is the owner when we're using this, and it also means landowner, and then kind of also defining what it doesn't include. Again, this still needs to be looked at by our legal counsel, but wanted to kind of get feedback from the group if you saw any issues with this or not. Had any concerns, comments, thoughts? Okay. Well, thank you much. All right, we're getting to the end. Definitely have more blues as we get into these last, I think it's two slides here. The project and project area, those are two, again, brand new. We have used the term project for everything quite a bit. I took kind of an example from, I believe it was Department of State Lands, and then kind of expanded on that as a start, but really trying to get down. This goes back to some of our application requirements, things like defining what your project is, defining the project area, and it's really basically just saying that this is everything that goes along with it, and then also the tying in that independent utility that we talked about previously, where it's being able to look at these and ensuring that these projects are kind of, I don't want to say one and done, but it's that it's not a stepping stone to something else. That, well, if I do this today, then I'm going to have to do this tomorrow. It's really looking at that more of, hey, you're planning on doing this, and this is what you're planning on being done. And it's not setting us up to have to say yes to something tomorrow because you asked for this today. And considering all those different impacts that come along with that. So I'd love any thoughts on project or project area. Okay. Public access way. This will be used with our activity, but it's also going to be used specifically or more related to the impacts of the project, in particular construction access and construction impacts and alteration impacts on public access ways. So I was really looking at trying to define that these are these areas that are not kind of, I'm going to call it private single person access. So we did in here basically saying that it's kind of community and local access points that are open to basically 4 or more resident or 5 or more residents, and not private that are 4 or fewer. So it's kind of trying to get away from, we have a lot of these private accesses that are up and down the coast, and most of them are unpermitted. And how do you kind of start balancing these in? And so really the intent of our regulations are to protect the public access and trying to put some sideboards on that. So again, would love some thoughts on that if you have them. Go for it, Laurel.
So Kevin, I'm looking at the definition. So it would include what could be construed as private accesses in this particular definition for this set of rules then, if it's
private, that's more community access points, yes. So, and the intent behind that was for, these HOAs, gated communities where, they've got dozens of homes. Really, in effect, those are, I'll say, public access points from that standpoint if it's open to all the community users. What we were trying, at least my intent in this and based on the discussions that we'd had, was trying to get away from kind of the individual access points. And part of why the 5, kind of coming at that 5, is that it narrows it down from some of the duplex quads, those kinds of things that are out there, and gets into more of that actual community. But it is trying, and that's a balance. And I guess that's part of what I'm asking the question here, is that should we have public mean purely public and have no community access, or should we have some of these more local access points? And that's part of the issue we have out here.
Would it make sense to separate them and still have that defined for community access? Because I think it muddies the water a little bit when you say they're public when they're not accessible to the general public. Other folks might want to discuss that. Just pointing it out.
Go ahead, Cameron.
Yeah, public access. My problem with the definition, or at least my question with the definition, is where it says frequently legally protected through an easement or right of way, but it often isn't. Many public access points are just, if people were forced to it, they could prove with old pictures and old documents that they have been using this or that access for, the last 50 years. But there's tons of access points on the coast that are to the general public, but are not actually legally protected because they haven't needed to be. Nobody was making a fuss about them. And then somebody does make a fuss, an adjacent landowner or somebody who's claiming land that actually belongs to the state or the city or the county. And then there has to be proof made that this is legitimate public access. So I'm just wondering if we're narrowing the definition of public access, if the principal definition is a partial one, that it's frequently legally protected through an easement or right of way, which automatically leads to the question, well, what about all the ones that aren't? Aren't they also public access ways? And is there a way to make it clearer that they're all protected, even if they don't have a legally protected easement or right of way?
That is a very good point. I will need to, I'll need to play around with that thought. That's, and Cameron, I'd love to have any thoughts or background and kind of considerations for language on that. Because yeah, the intent for this is to capture, you know, the public access to the beach. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, is we need to protect where the public can get. And so yeah, I think it's kind of looking at that on that broader scale. So yeah, I don't want this to be artificially restricted. And that was part of why I tried to also include the community access, because those are very important access points in some areas. And so kind of being able to frame that a little bit broader is what I was hoping to do, but I don't think I hit the mark. So yes, I would appreciate any kind of technical thoughts you have on how to correct that.
I think I would say one other thing right now. I think including the community access is good. It's valuable, because there are a lot of places that are kind of in between. They're kind of public, but they're inside of gated or semi-gated communities. I just I know that there are legal definitions for public access ways that are not protected by an easement, a formal easement or right of way. But I don't know where a good definition is. I've seen legal cases where it had to go to court to prove that there was a public access way, even though there was no private and no easement or right of way agreement. So I think the best place to go, and I'm not sure where that is exactly, but I know there are definitions out there for public access that would solve this problem. I just don't know where they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I said, any thoughts you have on how to tweak that or that definition or so, I definitely appreciate those, and when you do your written comments too, just because, and feel free to hack it up. Because that was the intent behind that frequently legal, is it's not understanding that not all of them are, is that but we have a lot of things like the road ends and other places that do have those right of ways that are there, and the public commonly uses them. But you're absolutely right, there are a lot of places that don't necessarily have those, that the public is commonly using. John.
Pretty much what Cameron said. Actually, I'm kind of glad you went first, because I anticipated she was going to give a much better response than I could. I guess the only thing I would say is just from experience, kind of depends on what you want to use the term for. So depending on where you're using the term public access way and your process, you may want to consider focusing the application of the term on what it's going to accomplish for you in receiving or processing an application, because ownership will play into some of what you have to decide later on. So if somebody's trying to make an improvement to a public access way, you're obviously going to want to see the ownership of the property, if it's real property, unless it's an easement or a right of way, still probably going to want to see some easement documents. If it's a real platted right of way, that's going to make it a little easier. But I think that might be part of what I would suggest. But that's the problem with public access ways, is that I, you know, it's everybody assumes it's a public access way until somebody decides it's not, and then there's a fight, and then until the fight's over, nobody really knows what it is. That's not always true, but that, as Cameron pointed out, that can be true, and on the ocean shore, I think it might be frequently true, because if it was some customarily used point of entry into, from a street to the ocean, and then one day somebody came along, bought the property, and said, well, actually it's not anymore, that's usually where the fight started. And so it just kind of evolves from there. But if you're using that term when you're addressing an application for something, you might be able to narrow your definition and put a kind of a qualification in the definition. Says, and as it relates to this is what it means. I don't know if that helps, but that's kind of my initial suggestion. So.
No, that actually helps a lot. Thanks, Sean. Megan.
I was just going to suggest that the Lincoln City has like 27 public accesses, and they've asked me to come talk to them about them before. So I think I mentioned this to you, Kevin, before I met with them, and they might have some thoughts about the definition of public accesses that could be beneficial, since they're trying to work on maintaining them all the time.
Go ahead, Rhiannon.
Thanks. I'll just add for the group again, not for you specifically, Kevin. As you know, Meg Reed with the LCD is currently leading another rule-making process specifically for public access. And so Kevin and I have been conferring with her on some working definitions that she has, including one for public access. So we're trying to coordinate between DLCD and OPRD once again. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think the part I'd add to it too is the one unfortunate pieces are the intent, kind of what John was getting at. The intent and the target of the definitions is slightly different. So it's what can we cherry pick off each other so we have something that's not in conflict, but at the same time, it's not necessarily for the exact same purpose. And so that's, I'll say, what'll be probably the challenge at the end, where we won't necessarily have an exactly the same definition, because we will need to be clear that, ours is more, looking at impacts of the projects, where, DLCD is looking more at, I'll say the overall planning and of those. And so how do you build those two together? And that's going to be a little bit of a juggling and balancing act, I think. So
in my conversations with Meg, though, she did not seem to think that that was going to be a problem, because they have different intents. Having slightly different definitions is fine, as long as they're not in conflict with each other. I think they should, kind of run like somewhat parallel, not divergent too much. But I think it's fine, since they do have different definitions. Thanks.
All right, so I'm going to move down public costs. This was another one. So I can't remember how much I used, but this is one that Rhiannon and I have been talking a lot about lately, is public cost. So in our current rule, it specifically mentions that no public cost to the agency. And in the context of it, it has things like ultimate removal of the structure and things that kind of make this look at this longer term piece of, is there going to be some sort of impact to the public financially by allowing this to happen? But because that statement is buried in a statement for other kind of covering other terminology and other things, it has been interpreted very directly by our applicants as well, the public's not paying for the structure, so therefore there is no public cost of this. And so trying to kind of morph what the guidance from DLCD has been, plus what our understanding of what the public cost is, and doing a little bit of online research. This is where I've come up with this new definition. And one thing I'll point out is really the definition is only the first couple lines, but then it's giving the examples at the end. Those examples probably will get moved to guidance, but it's something where we wanted to be much more clear that it is direct and indirect financial and non-monetary impacts. It's not just, well, the public didn't pay for the project, so it doesn't matter. Because again, in that context, it's like, well, the public pays for public access ways. So we have to give that consideration that there's a cost to the public and might say no when that's what the beach bill says we're supposed to support. But because the public's not paying for something that fills an area of the ocean shore or detrimentally impacts the ocean shore, it no longer becomes a consideration. It just, the logic flow doesn't meet. But our rule is ambiguous enough that we haven't really been able to hold this down. And so we do know that the intent between the legislation and the rule was to have public costs considered. So this new definition is trying to fill that gap. So I'd love to have any feedback on this public cost. And if somebody has an example of a good place where that has been defined and it works well, I'd also love to have that feedback. John, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have a good example of where the public cost as a definition has come into play. The only thing I mean, I wouldn't know how to define this any better. This is fine. This is a good definition. But to just maybe throw something on top of this, the value of the public's asset, if the beach has an asset value, if the ocean shore has an asset value, if there's something that somebody does and it diminishes the value of that asset, that is your public cost. So I also don't know how you appraise that value, and I guess I would maybe start with somebody who does appraisal for as a job, as a living, as a profession. They probably be able to steer you in the right direction. But I would say there's a diminishment of asset value in doing something on the ocean shore that either degrades the scenic quality or access or some other physical alteration that prevents people from enjoying that ocean shore the way they were before the improvement or the structure was made. And I don't know I don't know, again, I don't know how you get to the value of that asset. And I think that's kind of I guess that would be something I would have to look at in a regulatory sense. Somebody would have to come along and say, I want to do this thing. And then if I had a responsibility to assess the cost to the public, I would have to have a methodology for saying, okay, well, this asset's worth this, you're doing that. There's a devaluation of our asset as a result of what you're doing, and here's what the public cost is. And then how do you compensate for that? How do you amend your project to reduce that impact? Those types of things. Again, it gets very complicated. And then I think the methodology for assessing the public cost is the challenge. And that seems like a rabbit hole of a conversation too. So I think I'll just stop it right there.
Well, that is so fair, John. That's why this is kind of, as we talked about with mitigation, I'm trying to steer the ship, but we don't necessarily have a full rudder yet until we have mitigation and have probably a work group that actually defines how we get to all of this. Because I think currently in our rule, it actually says prior to submitting an application, the applicant needs to basically consider mitigation for, and one of them is the public cost. And so again, that's currently in our rule. It's something that we've had forever, but we don't implement it because we have no idea where to go. And so what this is trying to do is steer that ship a little bit, just a little bit further, so we can be like, yes, as you said, our asset is being diminished, or you're doing some of these things. That is a public cost, and we are going to consider that. It's up to you as an applicant to tell me what you would do to offset that, because you're the one proposing this, and we can then make a determination if it is, if it is, replacing that adequately, whatever that, however that looks. And so that's where that mitigation is kind of framed right now. It's still kind of the same structure, which is the applicant needs to propose it, which I don't like because it's a little bit of a give me a rock, but it's a lot clearer of, we need a rock that looks the same, is the same size as what we have. Don't just come in and say, the public didn't pay for it, therefore we don't have to consider this. And so that's what I'm trying to get around now. But you're absolutely right, and I think we will end up having a subsequent work group at some point to really talk about mitigation, and this will be a great one to talk about, and probably have an economist on that work group to be like, hey, we need to know what the beach is worth before we do this. How do we figure that out?
And by the way, I think going for the low hanging fruit, so to speak, here, the hard costs that are absolutely demonstrable, just go for those first. So you put something on the beach, if the state of Oregon has now some sort of maintenance cost associated with whatever you just did, that's all right. That's a public cost. That's a starting point. So obviously anything that's a hard demonstrable cost to the public, that goes into it first, and then the more maybe a little more subjective analysis of what's the beach worth, what is this doing to the value of the asset, that still, I really think that's important. There needs to be a methodology for that, I think. But I didn't want to blow over the fact that there are actually some real easy demonstrable costs. There's just no, you're going to do this thing, we know it's going to cost the state X amount of dollars in annual maintenance or every decade or something like that. So just want to throw that out too.
All right. Laurel, did you have a comment?
I think John covered it. I was just gonna, there are some potential other ways of describing it. It's sort of the concept of externalities and economics, like how do you value those things, those sort of social costs or external costs for non-market goods like the beach value, or other things that aren't, I don't think we're going to, like you said, figure it all out, the whole mitigation thing, but we can try and, I think it's a good starting point, the definition, but maybe there's a few tweaks that we can make related to some of those things like ecosystem services or the recreational loss, or I think that's mentioned in there, but it's a tricky one to quantify. I think John made a good point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't think, I kind of have ecosystem services, but I like having that. That's a good point, because we do have some of the recreation in that, but and some of the other pieces kind of touch on ecosystem services, but I think having that broader term might actually be good in that examples.
Yeah, there's the hard costs, like our actual government expenditures, but then there's those external costs that are, if something is impacted by pollution or destruction of an area that can't be used for a certain period of time, or the ecosystem services, or yeah, I don't know. I'd have to spend some more time with the definition, but.
Cool. Okay. Let's see. So going down through to this is our last slide. Hey, we're almost there. We're going to end early today. The repair permit, currently don't have that defined in a section. It will be there. It's mentioned, but the whole point behind that was trying to get at bringing some of the statute language that was there into rule, and making sure that we actually define that there is a option for repairing something, but it's only if it meets specific criteria, and those are already outlined in statute. So it's just reiterating that. Responsible parties basically the same. Shoreline erosion control, this was a new one, kind of to tie some of those pieces back together. After we've had our dialogue, I think I'm going to propose also making some adjustments to this so that it includes kind of a, for lack of better terms, a spectrum of nature based to gray and it includes hybrid as well, and kind of defining that. And based on some of the conversations we had internally, I'm going to kind of try to do that so it reworks that second half of it too, with the prioritizing the structural or the nature-based over structural. So it's kind of, I'm gonna try to rework that one a little bit more to clearly define that pathway that we talked about earlier. And so thank you for those comments, is that I think will make it read a little bit better. And it also, most everything starts out with the shoreline erosion control, and then within that topic are those other categories. So I think that'll help us kind of better frame all that. So I don't think we need to talk about that one unless anybody has any other ideas on that. Diana?
So one thing that I would add is that you have erosion and flooding together. And in Washington, in the armoring classes that I've taken, they start at the very beginning saying that those are very separate and need separate solutions, and that armoring can never be a justification for addressing flooding. So, and I can give you, FEMA and Army Corps and Danish hydraulic, I can give you some citations if that's helpful for you, but I'm noticing that you guys do have them in, and I have been a part of applications where they're unable to prove that the erosion is significant enough to justify harm armoring. And so they'll take the track of, well, if the erosion is allowed to continue, then the chance of this property experiencing flooding, which is going to lead to structural failure, and therefore we need to have the hard armoring. So it's kind of right now this gray area or back door kind of. So I would like to see that that fleshed out and separated, because and
well, I'll even go one over on that.
Okay, good.
That wasn't intended to be in there. I think that was a copy and paste error, so I appreciate you. It was somewhere where I had grabbed it. It had that erosion flooding, and I'm like, we don't deal with flooding. And honestly, the conversations I've had with DLCD and others is, when you start experiencing flooding on the outer coast, at that point in time, we need to be having another discussion, because really the armor isn't the solution anymore, right? It's you need to be doing other upland methods to address that. And we've had some people that have come in and said, well, now it's getting overtopped. Well,
right.
Okay, then you really probably need to be thinking about something different. So
well, I'm glad to hear that. Good.
So yeah, so that was an error from cut and paste. I did not intend, because obviously I don't even know how flooding would fit in on, or what we look at for erosion control projects. So, I mean, it's a consideration not to increase flooding, but flooding isn't a cause for erosion control.
Okay.
So, anyways,
good.
So thank you for pointing that out. Rhiannon?
Yeah, from our internal group, I can't remember if it was for shoreline erosion control, or I think it was for structural erosion control. We were talking about incorporating beachfront protective structure within the definition, just so that it's in line with DLCD and the erosion control guidebook. Thanks.
Yes, and I had that in my notes from our small work group, so I had it here too. Okay. All right. Cameron.
Let's see. Oh, I actually was going to talk or say something about structural erosion control. Are we still going to be on?
Feel free. We're
track?
on this. We're on this page.
Okay. So structural erosion control is basically various fancy means of deflecting the waves from my house to your house, and riprap is particularly notorious in that regard. So I just wonder if the definition is really helpful there, because it talks about redirecting wave energy and to minimize or eliminate coastal erosion risk, but many of the hardened structures don't actually do that. They do redirect the waves, but they don't minimize or eliminate coastal erosion risk. Quite the contrary. So that doesn't seem like a useful facet of the definition to me.
Okay. Yeah, there probably can be a little refinement of that. And I don't remember, Rhiannon, I'd have to look, 'cause I think I might have borrowed this from the erosion control guidebook. So we'll have to take a look at that together, Rhiannon, and kind of see what we want to do, because I also don't want to get too far aside of that. But I think that's where my base came from, but I will definitely look at that. So thank you, Cameron.
Mhm.
Any other thoughts on structural erosion control? Diana.
Yeah, I was going to make the same point that Cameron did, but also, do we want to put in here something about that you're protecting the primary structure? In a lot of the applications that I see in Cannon Beach, they will talk about protecting their slope. They own it. They don't like seeing it disappear. And so I've sat in hearings and watched people deliberate and debate, what are we trying to protect? Is it the actual land, the slope, or is it the structure? So I think that should be addressed in this, saying something about the upland primary structure, or however you would say that, to make it clear that it's not, you get some sort of hard armoring because you're seeing erosion on your slope.
Thank you. Cameron, did you have another comment?
Yeah, I was just gonna say something about the methods listed here. Where is it here? Geotextile sandbags. That is a really difficult little mouthful. Is that a form of structural erosion control? I always thought of geotextile sandbags as more in the nature-based soft control rather than the structural hard armoring category.
Yeah, and I'm looking at this from that's another one of those small tweaks that we were going to make based on our internal discussion. Is I think the difference between structural and non-structural will be that if you're using biodegradable sandbags, burritos, those kinds of things, then it would fit under a non-structural. If you're using geotextile, basically non-biodegradable, then it would be considered a structural. And so, and I think this is, again, we're using the terms that are in the erosion control guide, where if you look at that technique of geotech sandbags, they're basically the large bulk sandbags that are, basically hoisted by a crane effectively, or a large piece of equipment, and set in. And so they're a fairly significant structural. They're not deformable. They're really laid there, where I think what we're looking at with the biodegradable and that type of stuff within the nature, within the non-structural, is they're going to become part of, but they are a temporary, stabilization. Where I'm looking at some of the sandbags we put in at Cape Lookout as part of that dynamic revetment. They're 20 plus years old, and they're still buried in the dune, and they're still relatively intact, except for the ones that have been exposed and then have photo degraded and are needing to be or have needed repair or replacement. But they're again, they're a long term
Well, maybe you could put
piece.
Something like non-degradable geotextile sandbags or something that
Mm-hmm.
Differentiates them from the more nature-based solutions. Because I think for some people, anyhow, just reading that sandbags, well, that's a natural thing. They move. You can sit on them. They bend. That's not a hard armoring thing. So you might want to, if you want to leave that in there, and I understand where you're coming from, you might add some term that makes it clear that we're talking
Mm-hmm.
about a kind of sandbag that is actually not really nature-based.
Yes.
And right now, under Goal 18, sandbags are considered structural solutions.
Okay. I didn't realize that all sandbags are considered structural.
We don't have an exact definition for structural right now, which is part of the reason why Senate Bill 504 is possibly moving forward. But we generally give the advice that sandbags are considered structural, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think it becomes I'll say it becomes somewhat of a problem when you start looking at things like geofabric or biodegradable geofabric like burritos and soil lifts, and for bank resloping and that, because it's necessary for that temporary stabilization until the vegetation gets established. But those have a different intent and purpose than a sandbag does. Now, there are places where you could do that on a smaller scale with biodegradable sandbags, but that hasn't been what we've seen used on the ocean shore. Typically, the sandbags we've seen have been effectively a structural method. We go and we grab a bunch of sandbags, we fill them up, and we dump them to stop erosion. And so trying to, as Brianna said, trying to kind of define some of these a little bit cleaner will help with the implementation, but there also needs to be fixes on the Goal 18 side of things too. And so that's where we're trying to kind of start this ball, but we can't push it too far, because if we say that structural doesn't include something, but yet it's excluded or it's included in Goal 18, then it's going to create a problem between the two rules as well. Megan.
Yeah, I was going to comment that I think maybe it might help to include in the first sentence means methods to control coastal erosion are intended to remain in fixed position with the purpose of, and it says just redirecting wave energy, but I think it should say purpose of dissipating and or redirecting wave energy. The reason why I think dissipating is important is that's I think the better mechanism, which gets at Cameron's point, not just redirecting it to offshore or someone else's property. So I think there could be what Oregon would consider structural solutions, like large wood that is interlocked together statically, that is able to dissipate, has been shown in other places to dissipate energy and actually encourage accretion of sand in the area, rather than just like riprap, which its purpose is really, redirecting the wave energy. Obviously, some is dissipated upon wave breaking.
No, okay, that's actually a really good point, Megan, because this isn't intended to only define, a seawall or a revetment. So I think having some of that could help that, especially because we want to encourage less impactful structural solutions too, especially as they move towards nature-based.
Yeah, and so then in that vein, I think in the methods to include, maybe also including some methods that are not just like riprap and revetments and seawalls. So like large wood that's anchored together, or there could just be a couple other features in there that would be nature-based, but Oregon would consider to be structural.
Okay, yeah, that's a very good point. And Megan, if if you're able to pull together a few of those methods, that would be more likely structural. Because I mean, I can think of a few, but I'm just saying, you're kind of out
Yeah,
in the
I'm
more
putting the
practitioners area of that and seeing what those are. I think that would be great to just add, if you could come up with a few of those things that could be added to that, that would be awesome.
yeah, I'm putting the comments. I'll send you my.
Yeah,
Sorry, I didn't do it in the Google Doc. I just
no
did it
worries.
on my computer this time. But yeah.
No worries. Yeah, the important thing is to get the information and the comments that you guys have. So, okay. Diana, did you have another comment?
Yeah, I was wondering in the structural erosion control, is it even possible to eliminate coastal erosion risk? I mean, to say eliminate seems strong to me. Megan?
Uh, Probably not eliminate. Maybe mitigate was a better word.
Or minimize.
Yeah, and minimize is in there, so I think we probably get rid of eliminate. And I'm going to say that I'm just going to look back at like I just based on the study the paper that came out in I think it was late 24, by one of your old professor, Ian, out of California.
Gary
Anyways,
Griggs.
thank you, Griggs. And and I think you're absolutely right. The research shows that you're not eliminating it with you're either buying time or you're minimizing or you're potentially creating an expectation of safety when maybe it's not as permanent as you think it is. And so I think that minimizing would be, I think, more supported by the literature.
And I think it would be really helpful because people still believe that if they are able to get that, gold standard riprap seawall, it's a one and done and they're set. So I think it's good if all of our language is talking about these as management processes, rather than a final solution, the final solution. And then I also wanted to touch on the geotextile sandbags. Cameron was surprised that is considered structural, and I was too. Um, with the erosion control manual, they talk about vegetative solutions, and they show two burritos in Cannon Beach, and the older of the two is geotextile. So I'm I've been saying for years that that's an example of a nature-based solution, and by this definition, it's not. Maybe you guys would consider it, a hybrid. I'm not even sure. I need to see what definition comes up for hybrid, but and then the newer burrito example that is in the guidebook is they did use natural core base and sand. And actually that one is all full of cobble, which has me have a whole nother question. How is it a sand burrito if the primary medium seems to be cobble? But that's not for here. But that fact that geotextile, when those are the products that have been successful there's a few of them, like 4 for 20 years in Cannon Beach, falls into the structural is kind of a bummer. Because it has been proven to do so well in that high wave action environment. So those are my comments. It's something that I just realized really recently that, oh, that is a structural. So maybe you guys were always thinking about it that way, but I think not, well, anyway, I'll stop there.
Well, and kind of to point out what Rhiannon was saying too, that's part of why the Senate Bill 504 is so we can start looking at a few of these things too. So, and maybe start refining some of these topics so that they better reflect the state of technology today, and see where that goes. All right, Tyler, you had your hand up for a while.
Hey, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, so there there is a distinction kind of between sandbags and clay burritos. They are different. So like there's not necessarily like a size description, I don't think, in the erosion control guidebook for sandbags. But like they're pretty commonly used on the East Coast. And like when I think of a sandbag, I think of like a 8 foot by 4 foot, sandbag, not a sandbag you necessarily buy from Home Depot that's, a white foot by 1 foot, holds a scoop of sand and that's that. So there are different sizes and shapes of sandbags. And so the clay burrito is really designed to be more permeable and to just sort of hold. And Megan, please jump in if I'm misrepresenting this, but it's my understanding that like the clay burrito is really designed to stabilize, but then be overtaken by vegetation in a perfect world. Whereas the sandbag, it's really just a sandbag. It's just a naked plastic sheet or jute sheet that holds sand. And then the other comment that I had, Kevin, was structural erosion control probably needs to tie directly to DLCD's Goal 18 and beachfront protective structure definition, because that's really what we're trying to correlate that to. And I think that's missing. I'm not sure if we talked about that the other
we did
day,
talk.
but
Well, yeah, and even Rhiannon brought up the whole tie it back to the beachfront protective structure. But yes, your Goal 18, I think potentially in the definition. I know we have it in the rule, but we may need, it may be good to tie it back to the Goal 18 side of things too, where only available on Goal 18 properties or something like that. So that's a good thought. I know we have that in the rule itself, but whether or not it needs to be in the definition, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Rhiannon?
Yeah, I'll just add onto the discussion from the erosion control guidebook. So it does differentiate between sand burritos and sandbags, and it does have sandbags under the structural solutions. But we also have in here a definition for beachfront protective structure, and I think this gives some light onto why those are considered to be structural. And it says a static structure that is intended to remain in a fixed position with the purpose of redirecting wave energy and to minimize or eliminate coastal erosion. And they're purposely constructed and intended to maintain that form over time. And so that's how we really differentiate between structural versus non-structural. And so because those sandbags, like you said, some of those projects are still in place a couple decades later, that kind of lends, sorry, my dog is attacking my hand, it lends itself to the structural solution definition. And the other thing is that, yeah, Diana, I agree that, having a definition for hybrid or having the flexibility to have a more hybrid type structure would be great. And that's something that we are hoping to incorporate into 504 rulemaking if that moves forward. And we're going to be looking at Washington as kind of an example of how to do that, because they do have a lot more flexibility than we do currently right now. Thanks.
All right. Tyler, did you have any other thoughts? Or is your hand still just up? Okay. Well, any final thoughts on structural or any other definitions? This is the last of my slides, so I'm willing to go back to any of the other slides, any of the other definitions, if you had any thoughts come up as we were going through this. So we still do have a few minutes. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Katie.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Somehow my video was not wanting to start. So the next thing we had on our agenda, we kind of went backwards, but we wanted to just check in, and we did it a little bit while Kevin was off, if there was any feedback from the previous sections that we wanted to make sure to offer an opportunity to go back to anything that was there. Well, then we will wrap up for today. We will take all of the information from the definitions and the other information there. It is all in the Google Drive now, and keep working on making edits to that. Our next meeting is on the 12th of February. So about 2 weeks from now. And we will get information out about what's ready for that agenda. So if anyone has additional feedback that you aren't able to get on the Google Doc, if you want to send it to Kevin or I, will make sure to get it in the file folder so that everyone has access to that. Other than that, I guess we're going to end a little early, unless Kevin, do you have anything else for the?
No, not today.
Okay. Any questions that are out there? We spent a little bit of time talking about process at the beginning of the meeting, so just wanted one last opportunity if there was anything from any of the previous meetings we wanted to circle back on. Okay, well, we'll end a little bit early and we'll see everyone on the 12th at 1 o'clock. Thank you so much.